So welcome to section 1 of the course, where we're going to be looking at how we can set up the Anypoint platform and get it ready for users and applications and APIs to be developed and deployed into the platform. So this section will include looking at Anypoint platform's access management controls, how we can set up Cloud Hub 2 as a deployment target, and lastly, how we can use API governance to ensure that best practices and standards are followed. In this video, we're going to start by looking at access management and get an understanding of what are controls and options available in the platform. So firstly, access management. Anypoint platform provides many methods to secure and manage access for users to the platform, and these tools are available in the access management tab. In that tab, you'll be able to find some of the following pages. So the first one is subscription details. So essentially your licenses and how much of the licenses you're using. You'll have the access to see your business groups and update, configure, create new business groups. And we'll go into those in a bit more detail in a moment. You'll be able to access and view your connected apps, so manage connected apps. And we'll also be able to manage identities or identity management to enable SSO or single sign-on. And we'll also be able to manage teams, which is how we can control permissions and user access. One thing to note is that recently the platform released some new features. In fact, Teams is one of those new features, and you should definitely enable those if you're able to, as previous features are being deprecated. So it makes sense to try and use the new features. So in the demo, we'll take a look at how we can do that. But essentially, you'll see a big button in the bottom left that says try new features. So firstly, subscription usage. So in access management, under subscriptions, you'll be able to see how many licenses that your organization has, and also how those licenses are being used. So that'll include your vCores usage, which is sort of the number of workers or CPUs being used and licensed for. Then the static IPs, VPCs, dedicated load balancers, which is a concept from Cloud Hub 1, VPNs and transit gateways, object store usage, and Anypoint MQ usage. Something to note here as well is on this page, the licenses and usage are business group specific. So in this screenshot at the top, you can see there's a drop down for business group, and you can change that, and you'd obviously see different statistics based on the business group. So what are business groups? Business groups are a way to logically separate your resources in the Anypoint platform. So what that means is you're able to deploy applications and APIs and control vCores usage across different business groups. You might have different environments, and certain users might only have access to specific business groups, and that can be controlled with the permissions. The business groups form a hierarchical tree, with the top level business group being the root of the tree, and then each business group below the root can have several children. So each business group will have one parent, but could have several children. By default, when you create a trial account or new organization in the platform, the name of that organization is the root business group, and then you'll create new business groups underneath that. As I mentioned, with business groups, you can control access, so a user might only have access to a single business group or specific set of business groups, and the permissions allow you to control specific business groups as opposed to all users can access all business groups. And usually you use business groups to logically separate resources, perhaps into organization domains. So for example, you might have a business group for HR, business group for finance, business group for customer experience. So the HR business group might contain APIs related to HR systems such as Workday or Concur for expenses, whilst finance business group might contain APIs related to accounting software or transactions processing. But that's optional and different organizations tend to arrange their business groups in different ways. This is just one sort of method that can be followed. Next up, connected apps. So connected apps are used to allow other systems to connect with the Anypoint platform. Some examples of this include if we want to automate deployments through CI/CD. To do the deployments, we might use the Anypoint command line interface. We might use Anypoint platform REST APIs. Now, we can't just use our username and password for the Anypoint platform to do these actions, because our user accounts probably have multi-factor authentication enabled, or we might be using single sign-on, in which case Maven won't support that. So connected apps can be used to create a set of credentials, client ID and secret, that these tools can then use to connect to the platform. So there'd be no multi-factor authentication and no single sign-on with the connected apps. And then just like a user, you can restrict the permissions and access on the connected app by using scopes to control what the connected app is capable of. Identity management. So as I've mentioned, single sign-on is possible. So single sign-on would allow you to log into the Anypoint platform with your organization, so maybe it's the email account. So if I worked at example.com, I'll be able to log in to like my Microsoft Outlook account and access the Anypoint platform. So with identity providers in the platform, they support OpenID Connect or SAML 2.0, and these are both two standards for identity management. And with identity management and SSO, users can be mapped to specific teams, which we'll talk about in a moment, based on groups assigned within the identity provider. Included a link here for configuring the Anypoint platform with Azure AD. So if your organization uses Microsoft to manage identities, then there's a guide there. And lastly, we have Teams. So Teams is a relatively newer feature to the Anypoint platform. Previously, permissions were managed by roles, which have now been deprecated. So previously, when you create a user, you then have to assign several roles and permissions which had to be managed and applied to specific users. And this became quite cumbersome, as you might have several developers and have to manage each permission on each developer when all developers need the same sort of permission. So if there was any changes to the permissions, you'd have to go in one by one and change each developer's access. Now, with Teams, it makes it possible to group permissions into teams, making it easier to manage access for groups of users. So as an example, your developers should probably have access to Design Center and Runtime Manager, and perhaps they should be allowed to deploy applications into the dev environment. So what you'd be able to do with Teams is create a developer team and put all those permissions and roles into that team, and then you just assign the team to your developer users. Another example would be platform operations should have access to managed servers. So platform operations teams are more interested in managing infrastructure. So that's another example of a team you might create. And again, these teams can be broken down by business groups. So each business group might have its own team. And that means, for example, if you had a HR business group and developers focused on HR APIs, you could have a business group, a team for HR developers, which can only access the HR resource business group. And a user can also be assigned to several teams. So you might have a developer that works on HR resources and also finance resources. So that's the background and theory. With that, let's jump into the platform. So in the platform, and as usual, we can come to the menu bar on the left, and we'll see this tab here for access management. So we'll go there. And the first thing we see is the organization, which is a page we'll come back to. But if we come down to the left, we see our subscription. Go on to Runtime Manager. And this is where we can see the licenses available to us and how we're using those licenses. So here you can see our organization name, some metadata. So I'm on the trial still, that's actually expired. And these are sort of the vCores and network connections I've got and everything. So You can see because it's a trial, it's quite limited, so a lot of these are zeros, but with the sandbox vehicles, you can see I'm currently using 0.2 out of 1. The next thing we'll look at is if we go back to organization. So currently, this is our list of business groups, and we can see I've just got one business group, which is Code Red Demo. So this is the root organization or the root business group. And in the top right, you can also select business groups here, and you can see this is marked as the root. So what we can do, a child business group, is we can click this, or we can go into the root. We can click the plus to the left of the root. We'll give this business group a name, so choose HR. We'll give it an owner, so this owner is going to be an admin of the business group, so it'll be me. Decide whether we want to allow the owner to create child business groups underneath it or not, and whether they can create environments. So let's check this. And then here we can assign our vehicles, so perhaps HR business group is going to need 0.2 vehicles, so we can assign that here. And add. And there we go, we can now see we've got our business group called HR. That's not loaded up there, let's refresh. And now we can see the business group also appears up here. So something to keep in mind is when you are logged into the platform, always keep an eye on which business group you're in, and you can control that with up here, as this will affect where you're deploying APIs to and which resources you're able to see. So now we've created a new business group. We can click onto it to get more details. So we can see the details of what we've configured. And I've actually forgotten to do something. So one of the things I mentioned is we want to try new features. So let's do that. So this is where we'll be able to get those new features. We can see this layout's changed a bit. Some of it's still similar. So subscription, runtime manager, still very similar. We can choose our business groups up here. You can now see at the top we've got users, teams, roles, environments, and then the business groups is actually here. So this is the page we're on. We can see our two business groups. So if we go to HR now, we can see those settings we gave it. We can go to child groups to create new groups. The access overview shows which users have access. We can create new environments. So let's create an environment called dev. And that would now appear in Runtime Manager as an environment that you can deploy applications to. You can see the roles available. So you might have a user who can create APIs, and obviously that will be the role you'd assign. You can also create new roles for specific roles. And then you've also got some limits. The next thing we'll do is we can go to the connected apps, and let's create a connected app. So again, these connected apps are to allow system-to-system access without a actual user's credentials being put into a system. So we'll create an app. We can call this Maven Deployer. Now we usually want to use app acts on its own behalf, so we get client ID and secret. We'll add scopes. Because this is a deployer application, we want to be able to deploy apps to Runtime Manager. So we can go to Runtime Manager here. For the sake of this demo, we'll give it a few different ones, so like create applications, delete applications. We can give it CloudHub admin. Read applications, sounds like it'll be useful. And that should be okay. I mean, you'd have to look into these properly to understand what permissions the Maven deployer will need, but this is just a good enough example. And next, again, we can choose our business groups, or which business groups this app should be able to access. We'll just stick with HR. And we'll let it access the dev environment. And that looks okay, so let's add the scope. Save. And then when we come back into it, we can see we've got our client ID, and click Show to see the client secrets. So these are what we would use in our systems and API calls or Maven calls that need to interact with the Anypoint platform. On the left, we've also got identity providers. So this is where you could create SSO and link single sign-on. So you'd go to add identity provider. You've got those two options, OpenID Connect or SAML 2.0. For Microsoft, that'll be SAML. And then you'd have to complete these details. But we won't do that now. And the other thing was the team. So let's see how we can create a team. Now, by default, you'll see that there's a team called Everyone at CodeRed Demo. So this is everyone, the root organization. And by default, if you create a user, as the name suggests, they will end up in this team, as this is for everyone. But we can also create a team. We'll call this HR developers. And the parent team will leave as everyone. So again, you can see this is a hierarchical structure for the teams. And then in here, we could add members. So if we want to add users to this team, we can do that here. We can add the permissions. So let's click Add Permissions. And again, we'll just look at the Runtime Manager permissions. For now, we'll just select all and say all developers or all HR developers can access the Runtime Manager. We'll focus on HR. And again, we'll just give access to dev. So now we've created these permissions for HR developers, and we'd be able to assign users to this team, and we'd be able to know that they've only got access to HR dev environment. And you can create child teams, and it says here, child teams will inherit permissions from their parents. So any child teams we create would have this HR dev access, but we could then add on to it. Metadata, and again, just some sort of platform level limits about using teams. And finally, let's look at how we can create a user. So we can go to users, invite users, and this just asks for an email address, and then you'll assign it to the appropriate team. So for example, HR developers that we've just created, whether they're a member or a maintainer of the team. A maintainer is someone who would be able to modify the team. Generally, you want to stick with member. And then you type their email address in. They'll get sent an email with an invite to the platform, and they would then create their username and password and be able to log in. So that was an overview of access management and sort of what we need to look at to prepare the platform for access and permissions and managing licenses. In the next video of this section, we'll be looking at Cloud Hub 2 and diving into different options available with Cloud Hub 2, and also how we can configure and set up a private space ready for deployments.